Well, what I'd like to do here this morning is we're going to return to Burlington English to kind of finish up our chapter before and actually just look at a few vocabulary words. So I think that's kind of what we're going to do this morning. So I'm going to go ahead and open Burlington English here on the screen and get you guys to see if you can help me with a couple of these vocabulary activities. So again, we were talking about 2 weeks ago, we were talking about sort of different generations of people living in the United States, people from other countries like you. We mentioned, second generation families and so on. So this was a good opportunity to kind of review a little bit of something we call compound words. Everyone, you can just say that there at your computer or phone. Compound words. Okay, so some of you might remember we've talked about compound words in other classes before, but if you notice here on the screen, and I'll pull up my pen tool here. Let's see if I can get it to work. If you notice, it says a compound adjective is a word that we create that's formed from more than one word. So basically, compound usually is the word two. So in this case, when we were talking about second generation was an example of a compound word. So for example, if you notice here, I'm circling it on the screen, that most of these compound words, most of them, not all of it, most of them usually use this little punctuation mark in the middle. Anybody know what this is called, by the way? This little, looks like a little line in the middle. Anybody know what this is called? Hyphen. Congratulations. So a hyphen. So many of these words we often call hyphenated because they use this hyphen to kind of combine them together. Now, of course, we can use hyphens in many words, and I'll be honest, hyphens are often difficult for English speakers. Like when I'm writing, sometimes I can't remember, do I put a hyphen in this word or not? So it's hard for us too to kind of think about, how do we how do we put these words together? So I want to be clear, the types of adjectives that we're looking at in this exercise are hyphenated. But of course, we have lots of words, lots of compound words in English that we don't use hyphens, and in fact we often use as one word. For example, if I I'll use the chat box instead. In the chat box, if I mention, for example, baseball or basketball, I just mentioned that one, those would be examples of compound words, two words put together to make one word. But here, because these are adjectives, it's much more common to hyphenate those compound adjectives. So again, that's just a little small spelling, a little small orthographic sort of thing, a some structural thing here. So again, we have examples like second generation, minimum wage, right? So these are some examples. Well, let's look on the screen here, guys. Let's see if you can help me. So what I want to do is I want to match the words in the green box to the correct compound adjective here and for the definition on the right. So for example, we can use microphones for this first activity. Which of the four words up here go with the word aged? And it says here from about the age of 45 to 64. Who can tell me?
Middle-aged?
Middle-aged. All right, let's see. So we'll put that in there, okay? All right, what about the next one? I see hyphenated with the word fashion, and it says not modern or popular now.
Old-fashioned?
Okay. All right, we put it there. Okay, what about the next one? Behaved, being good or polite.
Well-behaved?
Maybe well-behaved?
Yeah.
Oh, Saba's on a roll here. Okay. And what about the last one? Something minute, happening just before it's too late.
Last minute?
This one's easy, right? Okay, we got the answer. Okay. Well, let's check our answers first off and let's see if we're correct. All right. Congratulations. Now, again, we're going to practice with some of these words in just a moment. We're going to have a chance to kind of discuss with these words. But again, in thinking about some of these types of compound words, middle-aged, old-fashioned, what's interesting is sometimes we think about, could I create other types of compound adjectives thinking about these examples. For example, with aged, notice we say middle-aged, but we don't say young-aged. Right? Now we might use old age, right? Okay, so yeah, Saba, go to your refrigerator, get some ice cream. We say old age, but notice we don't say old aged. So what's interesting is many of these compound words are created and they're kind of specific. So for example, let's think about fashioned. Notice we say old-fashioned. We don't really say new-fashioned, right? I mean, so it's a little strange that some of these compound adjectives have really a very specific use, a specific example. So again, some of them, some of them might, like I see last minute. You might see somebody creating something like this, like next to the last minute, but really that's not exactly. I'll put it here in the chat box. If you notice here, that's not exactly a pretty frequent thing compared to the other groups other words we have here. So for like well behaved, for example, we might say badly behaved, but we would not think of that as a compound word. So again, that hyphen really does make a difference there. Okay, now we're going to practice with these words here in just a moment, but let's try one more little vocabulary activity just to kind of keep us going here. Okay, now everybody, what I would like to do now is we're going to use our chat, we're going to use the chat box for this activity. So everybody in the chat box, what I would like for you to do is let's look at the sentences on the screen, and then in the chat box, type in which one you think is the answer. Okay, so for example, for number one, let's do number one together. Most elderly people wear blank clothes. Okay, now if I look at my choices at the top, okay, everybody, which word do you think would fit there? Again, no mics, just chat box. Okay, all right, so everybody seems to be in agreement that maybe old-fashioned is the answer. Okay, and for example, if I click on show the first answer, all right, we got it. We're correct. Okay, now guys, I'm going to turn off my microphone and camera for just a moment, and basically I'm going to give you the chance to go through real quickly and see if you can identify the answers. Now, all right, so our time is just about up, so let's go ahead and show the answers. So again, let's see, check your answers and see if you were correct. Okay. All right, looks like most of us got the right answers there, so I don't think we had any big issues. Okay. All right. Okay, now what I'd like to do is I'm going to go ahead and go to kind of introduce the next lesson, but then I'd like to come back and have an opportunity to have some discussion using some of the words from the end of this lesson. Okay, so I'm going to kind of jump to let me close this here. Okay, to go to our next lesson to kind of introduce the lesson and talk a little bit about what you're going to be doing for the next lesson. Okay, so again, we're going to be looking at lesson number 3 in this particular, or module number 3 in this lesson, and that is the grammar portion in which we're reviewing the tenses. Now, what I'd like to do first is let's take a look at an example here. This is just kind of a quick example here. So if you notice, we have two people. So we have a person on the left here and a person on the right. So Tassi, why don't you be the lady on the left side? And Sunny, why don't you be the lady on the right side? Okay, so Tassi, can you read the first little bubble there for us?
Lived in the USA for a long time?
Yes, I moved here in 2005.
Okay, so in looking at these two examples, we see, of course, a kind of a mixing of tenses for different things. So once again, for example, notice the first person is using have you, right? So let's highlight that. So for example, have you lived? Okay. And if you notice, the person's response says, yes, I have. So what do we call this particular grammatical form or tense? Anybody remember?
Past.
The past.
Perfect.
Oh, you're 50% correct. Not the past perfect, but the present perfect. Yeah. Yeah, so that's kind of the thing we're going to just review a little bit here, Rena. Now, of course, there's a difference between knowing how to use it and knowing how to explain it. I think you'll find that's often the problem with native speakers, and this is probably true for everybody in this group, that as a native speaker, we don't really talk about grammar a lot. We just use it. So in this case, that's the idea. But really what we're discussing is actually a combination of things. So that's why I want to be clear in our introduction that when we're reviewing verb tenses, we're actually reviewing two different ideas, which is we're looking at the form of the verb and the actual tense of the verb. So for example, in mentioning, now again, I'm not a big fan of the annotation tool, but let's see. Yeah, so for example, which that's not terribly helpful there. Okay, I'll use the chat box. Yeah, so for example, if you notice, we have a combination of ideas. So we have the present, right, the present tense, but in a particular form, which is the perfect form. So again, that's why it can often be a little confusing because it looks like we're explaining something about the past. But some of you might remember the perfect form is when we talk about something that began in the past but is continuing on into some sort of potential present or even a future action. Of course, we do have the past perfect. We've talked about that in previous classes before, but again, I know some of you maybe are newer to the class since the last time we talked about some of these forms. Now, in looking at the second part of her example, so let's highlight that here. So if you notice the second part of example, though, she says, I moved here in 2005. Now, what would we call this particular example?
Perfect tense.
Say it again.
Present perfect tense.
Not the example I've highlighted. That would be the examples before.
Past tense.
There you go. Yeah, in fact, we would call it the simple past. So again, if you notice that word simple changes the idea just a little bit. So again, that's what I often find with students is that yes, we've talked about these things before, but it's really hard to keep that information in our brains. And again, when we're using grammar, when we're using tenses, that's a little bit different from explaining them. And that's, I think, often the problem that students have. I don't know, each of you in your particular language, you might have difficulties in trying to use certain verb tenses and certain verb forms, maybe because they don't exist in your language or maybe you don't use them frequently. For example, with the have you lived and yes I have, I've mentioned this many times in class in the past. I think English speakers use the present perfect a lot more than maybe other languages do. So I think that's maybe one reason why students often have difficulty with the present perfect. So this is one thing to think about as we're trying to become better English speakers. Okay. All right. Now, again, my goal here this morning is not to review all of the tenses, but to get you guys to kind of rediscover and explore some of this information yourselves. Now, again, what I'd like to do is I'm gonna just take a moment and let's highlight the story that we see here. This is a quick little story, and I'm going to get you guys to help me read it. So I'm going to zoom in here in the story, so hopefully you all can see that. Okay, so again, what I'd like to do is ask a few different people to help us read. So maybe Stephanie, could you help us with this first paragraph here?
Yeah. Fatima was living in Syria when the civil war began. More or?
Yeah, keep going.
Okay. She had just graduated from high school and was planning to start college, but life in Syria became very dangerous and she couldn't stay there. In 2012, she moved to the United States.
Okay, now thank you, Stephanie. So as we can see in this first paragraph, we see lots of different uses of the past tense, but not in the same form. So for example, I'm going to say a tense and a form. I want to see if you guys can identify it in the paragraph. For example, where do we see the simple past? Which examples here are in the simple past?
Graduated.
Say it again. Say it again. Your first part got cut off a little bit.
Became.
Became would be an example, yes.
moved,
and moved.
had.
Okay, so there's one and there's the other. Okay, now Tasi, you are 2 for 3. So became and moved are the simple past, but not had.
No?
Nope.
Okay.
Done.
Okay, so for example, these are the 2 examples of the simple past in the paragraph. Okay, now I'm going to switch colors. Let's see if I can do that. All right, I'm going to use blue now. Okay, now who can tell me which ones are in the past progressive or past continuous?
Was living.
Okay.
Was living.
All right, any others?
And was planning.
All right, very good. Okay, and then we have one more in this paragraph. Who thinks they can tell me what it is?
Past perfect.
There you go. Very good. So we had the perfect part we had talked about before. So Tasi, this is the problem here. This is a 2-part verb form. So in this case, had is the past, but it's working together with graduated. So in this case, this would be an example of the past perfect. Now take a look, guys. We have 3 different ways that we're using the past. So I think that's why it's often confusing when we talk about, is this the past, the present, or the future? Because again, there are different ways of looking at time. Okay, now again, we're not going to explain all of it here this morning, but let's take for just a moment that past progressive. Let's take the was living and was planning. Why did they use the past progressive here instead of the simple past? Why?
Because it's something that is not finished yet.
Well, we have to be careful. This is in the past, so everything is finished.
Yeah, I saw. I don't know how to say that.
Well, Tasi, look at the first sentence. Could you read the first sentence just one more time, where it says Fatima? Could you read that for us?
Fatima, yeah, my internet is not so good. I will try.
Okay.
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 Fatima was living in Syria when the civil war began.
Okay. Now, in the context of that sentence, Tasi, why did they use the past progressive?
Because she don't live anymore there. But
Well,
she
again,
was...
yeah. Okay. Keep going. No, keep going. I think you're going in the right direction now.
Yeah, I don't know. She was living there when the war began.
Okay,
the war is finished already.
Right. Okay. So here's the thing. So when something begins, other things, of course, are happening at the same time. But, for example, we might know when the Civil War began, right? We probably can go to Wikipedia or a history book and find out when it began. Now, but in the sentence, Tasi, do we know exactly when Fatima started living in Syria and when she left Syria? Do we know that at this moment in the story?
No,
that's the key. The past progressive is often used for actions that, yeah, of course, everything is finished. This whole paragraph, everything is in the past. But at the moment of that part of the story, the Civil War began. We know when the Civil War began. Civil wars begin and end. So in this case, what we're saying is when this event began, something else was happening at the same time. So often we use the past progressive because we don't know exactly when she started living there and exactly when she left. It just means at that moment, if I were to take a picture, like the picture behind me, right? The picture behind me there. So it was snowing when I took that picture, right? So again, I don't know when the snow began. I don't know when it stopped. But at that moment, I took a picture and there it is. So I know when I took the picture, exactly the moment. But I don't know when the snow started or when it finished. So in this case, same thing with Fatima. I don't know when she was living there exactly. I just know that at that moment, when I take that picture of that moment, that's what's going on. So for example, the past progressive is often used for actions that are continuing at that moment, but we don't know exactly if they began or ended at a certain time. Okay. Now, if we think about like in the example here where it says, but life in Syria became very dangerous. you might say, well, Mr. John, couldn't we say, but life in Syria was becoming very dangerous? Well, yes and no. If you notice, some words don't really work very well if we use them in different tenses. When something became dangerous, that means like it started, and there you go. So oftentimes some words like become may fit better in a one tense or another. Though again, that's not always true. It's not always true. Sometimes it's just a choice. Like in that sentence, but life in Syria became very dangerous. I think it would be fine if you said, but life in Syria was becoming very dangerous. I think that would be a perfectly acceptable answer. So I think you can see sometimes why it's frustrating for students, right? Because if Mr. John says, well, maybe two different answers could be possible, students want to start, pulling their hair out and saying, but I want one answer. What's the right answer? Well, I hope you all are learning there's not always one right answer. Language is not exactly a perfect science. So in this case, in some cases, yeah, I think you could make some choices. Now, look at the last sentence. In 2012, she moved to the United States. Now, could I say she was moving to the United States in 2012? Would that make sense?
No.
Why not?
She was moving.
It was not
Like
ongoing
she's still moving.
action.
Yeah, so Risa, say it again.
It was not ongoing past action.
Yeah, so for example, in 2012, she wasn't doing it over and over. She wasn't in the process. What they're saying is, in the sentence, she did it in this year. So 2012 had a beginning and an ending, and she finished it sometime. Now, I don't know exactly, but I know that she finished it. She moved. Now, some of you, maybe it's true. Some of you, maybe you have moved a lot in your life. But in this case, at this moment in 2012, this is what she did during that particular year. Now, again, guys, what I like to say to students is verb forms and verb tenses are kind of like glasses, okay? Now, let's think for just a moment. You say, well, wait a minute. How are they like glasses? Well, for example, sometimes we have sunglasses when it's sunny, right? Sometimes we have regular glasses just for everyday life. Sometimes I need reading glasses to see something close, right? So part of the idea is each example here are like different lenses, different glasses. Some let me see only very specific things, right? Some let me see maybe things that are more ongoing at that moment. So the idea here is, yeah, there you go, Saba. So she moved, looks like she moved a year after, right, the war. So in this case, what I want you to think about is that's what this is about. Using verb tenses in different ways allows me to express different ideas. So that's why I want you to think about in this lesson that each verb form is doing something specific in that situation, in that sentence. Sometimes I have to look at the whole paragraph. Sometimes I have to look at just that particular sentence. Okay? So again, it's not going to be easy. And honestly, most students I know, if they studied grammar in their country, they understand it very well. If they haven't studied grammar before, it can get, very crazy for students. And I don't want to make it crazy because honestly, I think, in my experience, grammar is not exactly the most exciting thing to teach. But some students love grammar because they can learn the rules. But then when they come to the United States and they have to hear and speak and use it, then it becomes very different and often can be frustrating. So what I want us to think about here, so I'm going to close my annotations for just a moment. So guys, what I would like for you to do is, for homework, you're going to try this whole activity, this whole lesson, and we'll do some extra practice in class next week. But I want you to notice here how this particular, and I'll zoom in a little bit, how Burlington English kind of presents the information. Again, I kind of want to emphasize that they use simple, continuous, and perfect in the word tense. I often call them forms, because each form has a present or future or past use. So the truth is here, they're kind of specifically focusing on just, for example, in the simple forms there, they've got present tense, past tense, and future tense. So in this case, I use slightly different words, but this is how they're using it here. Now, if you look at the continuous tense and the perfect tenses, there are future forms of these as well. But if you'll notice, not many people use the future in the future perfect. In fact, just the other day, don't tell my wife. Okay, she's in the other room, so don't tell her. But she tried to use the future perfect in a sentence, and suddenly I felt like, ta-da, English teacher. So I had to help with the future perfect. So it's not fun living with an English teacher. But anyway, I had to help because, listen, guys, that may be the only time we've used the future perfect ever in a conversation. So, so in this case, we're probably not going to focus on it too much. I know it's not fair. But the idea here is I want you to take some time, look through the explanations, and I want you to try the activities for next week. Okay? And then when we come back to class for next Wednesday, we'll do some practice and some review here today. But again, my general feeling about grammar is we could teach grammar all year, and it's still, you know, it's still hard to get it to fit in our brains. So that can be a real challenge. Okay, so again, that's what I want you guys to try for next time, is to try the whole lesson on the review of tenses. And I think for many of you, maybe it'll be a good reminder, a good way to refresh our memories as to how to use them. And we'll talk a little bit more about them next week. Okay, all right, so I'm going to leave the Burlington English and come back for just a moment to our presentation. Now, again, I know some of you might be new to this experience. This is something we tried in the Monday classes, the Monday chats, and I know some of you have not come to the Monday chats for a bit. So the nice thing about WebEx is now we have the opportunity to do breakout rooms. Now, some of you might remember breakout rooms from the spring when we did some examples in Zoom. So now WebEx has the opportunity to do breakout rooms. So basically a breakout room is you guys will go into a separate room and have a chance to do a little discussion. So I thought what we would do is take some of the vocabulary words, and I have some discussion questions that I want you guys to practice with each other. Now, just real quickly to review, because we'll have about 10 minutes to do the discussion. But real quickly, in a moment when I start the breakout session, again, if you're new to the experience, excuse me, if you have your phone or computer, you'll get a little message that will say join. So please, when you see that message, you'll click on join, and that's when you'll go to the breakout room. Now, the breakout room is just like the main classroom. You can do all the same things, microphone, camera, all the same things. Okay, and then I'll come in and listen a little bit just to see how everybody's doing. And then when I'm ready to end the session, end the breakout room session, you'll see a message on your screen that will say leave a session or leave the meeting. Please make sure you click on leave the session, not leave the meeting, because we don't want you to leave and go bye-bye completely from the class. Okay, so that when you see that message, that'll happen. Okay, now real quickly, here are the discussion questions I want you and your group to discuss. So let me read through them real quickly, just so we're familiar with them. So number one, it says, do you like to use secondhand things? Do you buy stuff secondhand? Or do you prefer to buy only brand new? Number two, for many teenagers in the U.S., their first job often pays minimum wage. In America, that's $7.25 per hour. Now, what about in your country? Is it common for young people to get a job when they're in school? And what do you think is the typical pay for young people? Number three, are you the kind of person who likes to plan things, or do you do everything at the last minute? Why or why not? Okay, this is the Christmas season, right? So this will be a good answer. And then finally, number four, when you were a child, were you well behaved or were you wild like an animal?